Hello everyone, my name is Abdul Aziz and I'm a technical lead in a financial organization. I have about 10 years of experience in software industry and recently, for a while now, I've been building authentication systems for various companies. Uh, so in this session we are going to talk about OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.0, the basics of both the systems. I hope by the end of this session you will get a basic idea of what the systems are and what they're trying to address and why are we going to use it and what sort of scenarios we would be using these on. Okay, so let's see why we need a new authentication system, why authentication and authorization system, why do we need a new one, what's wrong with the current authorization system. So let's look at what the system was before all of this. So if I take you to this, so most organizations will have something like this. So let's say that there are users, maybe internal users or external user, and they want to have access to this application. Let's just call it fancy web application. And that web application basically talks to an API, and you have a third-party API now, or a third-party application, whatever it is. And if that wants to have access to your API, then that's going to be sort of difficult without a common system that you both have. So normally what your application will have is something called a forms based authorization or an active directory based authorization, or something similar. That's what we used to do before anyway. So with all those systems, it's kind of very difficult to have a standardized way of communicating securely between a third-party app and your app, basically. So the same problem can happen within your organization as well. So for example, if you have two APIs here or two independent systems on this side, and if they both want to have access to this API, and you want to secure this API, and that's going to be really tricky. So you will have to invest into Active Directory, or you'll have to build your own mechanism, and it might not be secure, or you'll have to spend a lot of effort in building that. So that's where the OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect comes in. So what it tries to address is a common solution to a standardized way actually to solve a problem between two systems that wants to share data, especially web-based systems like a web application, an API, or a RESTful service, things like that. Right. So we saw the problem that OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect is trying to address. So what is really OAuth and OpenID Connect? So OAuth 2.0, it's the second version of the authorization framework. It's an open standard that was introduced a while ago, and the main purpose of that is to have two systems or multiple systems talk to each other in a secure manner and share and gain access to a protected resource that needs to be secure. OpenID Connect is an extension, or it's a superset of OAuth 2.0, and it tries to do a little bit more of what OAuth 2 is trying to do. We will talk a lot about in detail, but both are two different frameworks trying to address same or similar problems. Okay, so we are talking about security, authorization, authentication, and all of that. So people could easily get confused between authentication and authorization. So what really is the difference between authentication and authorization? This seems to be the most common question asked all the time. So what is authentication? So authentication, it's the process of verifying who you are in terms of a server or the protected resource, and it's proving who you are if you are the client or if you are the end user. So that's what authentication is about. It's just verifying who you are really. So a common example could be the ID card that you have, and for example your driver license could tell you who you are. It's basically an ID card. And authorization. So authorization is a process of proving what sort of access do you have now that we established who you are. So again, we can have the license as your as an example here as well. So the backside of your license will tell you what sort of access, what sort of vehicles you can drive. So that's what basically authorization is. So if you are going to use analogy like ID card, so you can think of it like that's what's used to open the doors. So that's what authorization is basically about. Okay, so now that we have seen the difference between authorization and authentication, so let's actually have a look at what OAuth 2.0 is. So this is the definition taken from the OAuth 2 specification. So as the definition describes, OAuth 2 is basically an authorization framework uh, designed to access protected resource between two HTTP or web services in a secure manner. And the important thing to note here is OAuth 2.0 is a specification, and there are various implementation of it from a lot of companies, individual developers in various languages. I will add a link to the description which will show you what those various implementations are. But the one that I have widely used is called Identity Server. It's based on .NET Framework, and there is a .NET Core version as well. So let's look at the problem that we saw before and then see how OAuth is going to address that. Okay, so this is the problem that we saw before, and the third party couldn't share the protected resource here in a secure manner. So let's look at how OAuth is going to simplify this. So all we're going to do is include an identity provider here. Now this is not going to be an exact implementation. So basically, uh, the end user will talk to identity provider to prove who he is, and then once he does that, identity provider will issue what's called a token. A token is basically a string representation of the user, of the access he has, of who he is in terms of OAuth. So in OAuth, a token can be used to verify who the user is, and we can also use that to find out the access the user has. So as soon as you get the token, with that token he can access any of the application that allows access. So for example, the token issued to the user could say this person is XYZ and he has access to the fancy web application or the web API. So then you can use that to go forward in your system. So if we have a look at the basic terms used in OAuth, so let's go back to the slides. So resource owner, so that's the most commonly used term in OAuth. So resource owner represents the end user. So that's the person who's going to have the username and password, or the person who needs to be verified or authenticated. And the client, it's most likely the application that's trying to let the resource owner gain access to the protected resource. And the resource server, which is the protected resource that you need to secure with all of this framework, and token, which is basically a string used to represent the access the user has or the user itself, and the grant type, which is the different ways you can get the token. So we'll go further slides about what these terms really mean, but for now these are the terms that's used in OAuth. As we discussed in the last slide, there are many ways to get access token from the identity server to gain access to the protected resource in OAuth 2. So these ways are called flows or grants, or even sometimes called grant types, which is the most important thing in OAuth to understand. So if somebody says what grant types you support or what flows do you support, then they really are asking what ways do you allow, or does your identity provider allow to get a token. Okay, so in OAuth 2.0 there are two types of token that you need to be aware of. So that's the access token and the refresh token. So when a user enters username and password, so the identity server will exchange that for an access token, which is basically a piece of string which can be used to verify who the user is and what access they have, uh, which can be shared among the systems, and it will have a limited lifetime. So the most common period is 60 minutes. Most common access token will live for 60 minutes. So that's where the refresh token comes in. So refresh token is something that you can use to renew the access token's lifetime, or you can get a fresh set of access token and a refresh token. It depends on the different types of identity providers implementation, but we will go and have a look at that further down the line. Now that we've learned that OAuth 2.0 is an authorization standard or a specification, and we've also learned about the common terminology used in OAuth 2.0. So now let's take a look at one of the grant types or flow types that we talked about before. So the most widely used grant type or flow type is called authorization code. It's a mechanism where the third party can gain access to the protected resource without actually knowing the username and password of the user, and the identity server will exchange the username and password for a token which will be sent to this third party, and this third party can gain access to the protected resource with just this token. So let's have a look at how this can be achieved. So this is a simple diagram. Let's have a look at our use case. So we have a internal application, and this is our protected resource, and this is the third party that needs access to this protected resource, and our internal application that also needs access to this protected resource, and this is our end user, also called resource owner, and this is one client in OAuth terms, and this is another client in OAuth terms. So now this person needs to basically gain access to this application, and he has a credential to do that, and this person also needs to give this application access to his data, which is here, but he doesn't have any credential for this application because this application doesn't host any data. We host the data, and this just uses that in some way. Okay, so let's have a look at how this is going to work. So I put together a small flow diagram on how this will work. So remember, this is all happening in a HTTP service, which means a website or an API or a RESTful service. So the first thing the user does, you can also call them resource owner. So he goes to the login page of our web application, and as soon as they go there, the web application detects that the user is not logged in. This can be done in a various mechanism to check if the cookie is present or whatever mechanism the application employs. So it will check, and as soon as the application detects the user is not logged in, the first thing it will do is it will send the user to the identity server. So notice this line goes all the way to the end user. This is because this is HTTP service. This will just send a redirection request to the browser, and the browser will redirect the user to identity provider. So as soon as that happens, the user will be presented with a username and password box from the identity server, and the username and password will be entered by the user. Uh, as soon as they enter the username and password, the identity server will check and make sure it's all okay, and if it is, it will redirect the user to the client application with what's called an authorization code. So that will go to the browser, and the browser will detect the redirect, and it will send all that to the to your application. So your application will receive the authorization code, and once it receives the authorization code, the first thing it will do is it will validate that this authorization code is right, is what is expecting. So there are a big list of not a big list, there are some steps that it takes, which we will discuss further down the line. So once the authorization code is validated, it will exchange that authorization code for what's called an access token. So access token is what is used to gain access to protected resource. So notice here the reason that we are not using authorization code as an access token is because the authorization code here is in plain text, and it's sent all the way to the client, and that comes all the way back to the application. So that authorization code is actually exposed. So which is one of the reasons why we do not use authorization code as an access token. So as soon as we receive the authorization code, we verify that, and then we go to the identity provider to exchange that authorization code for an access token. So we will have an access token which will prove who the user is and what access they have. So identity provider will issue us with an access token. So as soon as the application receives the access token, the first thing it's going to do is again check and make sure the access token is valid. That the access token is valid, the first thing the application normally does is logs the user in whatever mechanism that the application uses to log the user in. Most likely it will be cookies. So as soon as the user is logged in, most application what it will do is it will send that same token, access token, to the protected resource to get the user's data now. So this data can be anything, whatever the application needs or whatever it is in your case. As soon as the first thing the API or the protected resource, protected server, whatever you want to call it. So our first thing it will do after the access token is received is validate the access token. So the validation process, again, as I mentioned before, there are a few steps to validate it. I will talk about that in further slides. So as soon as the token is validated, it will send the requested data to the application, and the application will simply send the user back to whatever page, which is normally the page the logged in users would see. Okay, so that's how the user will be logged in. So now let's say that that's how the user gains access to our application and thereby gaining access to his protected resource. Now let's say that he wants to grant access to this application, this third-party application that we have zero control over. So the way this happens is it's almost similar to what we have. So basically the resource owner, he will go to the login page or whatever page on the third-party application. So at the point the third-party application says that it needs access to the protected resource, the first thing it should do is it will check its own database to see if this user is already granted access to this protected resource. If they haven't, it will send them to our identity provider. So that's redirect to our identity provider. So this happens like before. So the redirect goes to the user, and then the username and password form from the identity provider will be rendered. So one different thing that might happen here is the consent form. So as soon as they enter username and password, the user will be asked for a consent to say application XYZ is trying to gain access to XYZ of your resource. Are you willing to give access? So as soon as the user provides that access, the same process repeats. Identity server will send the authorization code through a redirect, which travels all the way back to the third-party application, third-party client, and the third-party client does the exact same thing as our application. So he validates the authorization code. If the authorization code is valid, he requests an access token with that authorization code. And once the access token is received, he will validate that and he will record that somewhere. So remember, access tokens are only valid for 60 minutes, which is okay for internal application. But for third-party application, it's a good idea to extend that time to a longer period, so the third party doesn't come to you for access like every time the user needs it. So we'll talk about that in more detail on further slides or further video. So the third-party application then will validate the access token and again record it or log them in or does whatever it needs to, and then it will now use that access token to fetch the data from the protected resource. And first thing the protected resource will do is it will go to identity server like before to check if the token provided is valid. So if the access token is valid, then it will send that data through, and the third-party application will do whatever it needs to do with that data. Now that we saw how authorization code flow actually works, let's try a demo. So, like I mentioned before, I used something called Identity Server 4, which is an implementation of OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect protocol. It's based on .NET Core. There is an implementation of .NET Full Framework as well. So I will add a link to this demo and this Git. This is open source, by the way. So I will add a link to the GitHub as well, so you can explore it. So let's have a look at the RFC, the specification for OAuth 2.0. So basically, the specification says that we need to the authorization request for the authorization code flow will have all of these parameters, and it needs to have uh, the following data. So once we construct it, it'll be something like that. So let's have a look at how we can do this. So if I take a look at this demo, this is a demo site hosted by Identity Server 4. And if I go to the discovery document, uh, so there are various endpoints. You may notice there's one endpoint for authorize. So that's what we are going to use. And if I go back, so they have a lot of clients for us to use. Remember, in our implementation, so we had two different clients here. Both of them were using auth code. So there was that client and this client. So we're going to find a client that suits our purpose here. So what I have done is I've clicked the code definition for here, and the client that fits our purpose is basically that one, single page application client. So the way this is going to work, so let's go to the specification. So first thing we need is a response type, and it says the value must be set to code. So I have created a response underscore type which is set to code as per the documentation, and then the client ID which is SPA, which I obtained from here. This is the client that we are going to use, which is called SPA. And as you see, it uses a grant type called code, which is authorization code. And then let's move back to the specification again. So the next one we need is the redirection URI. Even though it says optional, it's mandatory for this implementation of Identity Server. Um, I'm just going to remove this for now. So redirection URI, and if you have a look at this implementation, the registered redirection URI for this application is called that, and I have just basically put that in there. And then the next one is called scope, and even though it's optional here, it is mandatory for this implementation of OAuth 2.0. So let's have a look at the list of scopes. So the list of scopes registered for this client is all of that. So all I have done is taken the quotes out and then added a space in between them, and then use something like this to do an URL encode of them, which will basically give me that. Just basically percentage space is replaced by %20. So we add the scope there, and then the final bit in the specification is called state. Okay, so state is something the client application uses to maintain the state between the request that goes to the server and then comes back to the server. So if I show you our flow diagram, so as soon as we send this authorization code request to IDP, we send the state to identity provider. So which identity provider receives it, and when identity provider sends the data back, authorization code back to us, it will send that state also back to us. So we can store any data that we need to maintain the state between the requests in this object, and which is basically the purpose of that object. Okay, so I'm not going to store anything, but if you are going to store something, it's better to encrypt it. Actually, this implementation would demand that I specify some state, so I'm just going to plain text some random value. So if I go there, it's going to show me the login screen, and Okay, so they mentioned basically that user account should work. So let's try that. So watch what happens. So I'm just going to use the developer tools in here to analyze the request. So if I click login, so I'm posting back to the server. So watch what happens. So the server just sent a redirection request back. So yeah, see, redirection request back to the redirection URL that we specified, which is basically that. And look what it sent. So it sent the code. That's the authorization code. And it also sent the scope that we used, and it also sent the state that we sent originally. So once we receive this, we should be able to exchange this authorization code for an access token, which we will talk about in the next video. Okay, so we saw in the last video how to fetch an access token using username and password using the OAuth authorization code flow. So in this video, we're going to see the second part of it, where we're going to use the authorization code and fetch the access token from that. So I have the specification here for access token request. So as you can see, we need to go to an endpoint called token, and we need to pass in these parameters to fetch the access token. So I'll be using a tool called Postman. Okay, so this is Postman. So first thing is we need to find the token endpoint for the demo identity server. So if I go to the demo identity server, it's basically this one, and if I go to the discovery document of that, it's going to list all the possible URLs, and the one that I need is the token endpoint, which is basically this one. I'm going to copy the location of that, and we need to make a post request. So I'm going to change the request to post, and the body of the post request must be all of this, and the uh, type should be that. So I'm going to select that, and the first thing we need is grant type, and grant type must be set to authorization code, and then the actual code that we obtained from identity server. So the last one, the authorization code that we obtained from previous request, previous video, it should be expired by now. So I'm going to fetch a new one. So this is the URL that we used in the previous video. I'm just going to go to that URL again. So one addition is we've added offline underscore access to the scope. I will explain what this is in a few minutes. Okay, so let's go to this let's go to this link. Okay, so identity server has already logged me in. It sets a cookie on the browser, so which is what it uses to see if you're already logged in. So that's why it didn't ask us for username and password, but it issued a new auth code here. So I'm just going to copy that and then put it in our code. And the next thing we need is the redirect URI, which is basically what we put in here. It's just easier for me to copy it from there. Okay, so the next thing is client ID. If you see in the last video, we used SPA as client ID. So identity server also demands client secret. So I'm just going to add that as well. So let's see if this works. There we go. So it produced all of that. Don't worry about that. That is to do with OpenID Connect, which we will see maybe in the next class. Identity Server 4 implements both OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect, so that's why you're seeing that. So if you see the specification for the response, we need to get access token, which we do, and then we need to have the token type. In this case, the token type is bearer. When we actually use in the API, that will come into play. I will explain this when we actually use it. And the expire sin is in seconds, so this one's going to expire in 1 minute, 60 minutes, which is 3600 seconds. And then the refresh token. So refresh token is what, as I mentioned before, is used to fetch a new set of access token. So I will show you how to use this refresh token in subsequent videos or maybe in a different class. That concludes this class. Thank you very much for attending this class. If you, like I said, if you have any questions, just post it in the discussion. Thank you.